Okay, today we're going to look a little bit more at trompe l'oeil, that wonderful phrase in French that's now in English, in our English dictionaries, meaning to deceive the eye. We've looked at the ways in which Borges confuses the line between the fictional world and my world, the ways in which he inserts ideal planes into the real world, as he calls any fiction. And I wanted to look at some art that does that as well, this trompe l'oeil fiction, trompe l'oeil art that resembles in certain ways what Borges is doing on the printed page. I'm going to make that argument. I'm going to see if I can convince you that there's an analog between, or a similarity, a resemblance, a family resemblance between these paintings, which are largely painted during the Baroque period, the 17th century. But let's start. I start, in fact, with a 20th century painter whom you will recognize if you've been to the Menil Museum. Mrs. de Menil's museum has the largest collections of Magritte in existence. Magritte is the surrealist, a 20th century painter who loves to do trompe l'oeil. Do you see what's going on here? The painting, an easel, is standing in front of a window that is painting the reality behind it. There's a little line, do you see, on the right-hand side of the painting where we see the staples that are holding the canvas to the frame. At the very top we see that little clamp. But here, in one single picture, we have a great example of trompe l'oeil, art that belies its own reality, that painting in the painting that's really a discussion of painting. It's perfect that Magritte does a lot of these. Here's another one, same idea. He calls it the same thing. He puts nutty titles on his paintings. Maybe somebody will want to pursue Magritte. The Human Condition, in case you can't read it from where you are. Can you all, yeah, of course you can see, you've got your screen over here. I was worried. This is another. You see what's happening here. I'm going to make that pause if I can. Remember my metaphor of the transparent window for realism? We read a realistic book and we forget we're reading. We're not reminded that it's not exactly the same as our world, or obviously it's 19th century world. We enter into it and we're not asked to question what is real and what's not. This kind of painting, and trompe l'oeil generally, will require the viewer to say, is it real? What is real? I talk about two kinds of wonderment. We wonder, is it real? What is real? And we also wonder at the artist's capacity. That is, we're amazed at the artist's capacity to make us wonder, because usually the representation has to be so precise. You've just seen 3 window paintings of Magritte, and I don't think he uses windows accidentally. He's contesting that concept of the transparent window of art. This is art about art. It's not art about that window. It's not art about that tree. So on the glass pane, as you can see, that is broken, the picture of the tree remains. What are we supposed to do with that? We're supposed to kind of smile, I think, and say, oh, that's a kind of interesting landscape. It puts an idea into the realism, and the idea is that it's a painted thing. So he calls it, trompe l'oeil fools you, and one of the ways it can do so is by calling attention to its own status as painting. And that's what Borges does all the time. He calls attention to the fact that we're reading the printed page, and he subverts often our sense that this is a real world. He reminds us that it's a readerly world. So that's a generalization, but now I'm going to show you. I wanted to start with Magritte because it's so clear what's going on in Magritte. But now let's see, I'm interested largely in the Baroque, which happens to be an interest of mine at the moment, and I think Borges is as well. Borges is interested in everything. But now think of the Library of Babel for a minute. This is the painted ceiling, and here's a detail of it. Now, I want to go back to the painted ceiling. It's a church in Rome, St. Ignatius Loyola's church, and it is a domed ceiling, but what is the trompe l'oeil here? We are meant to think and to feel that we're looking at infinity. So you'll look up and look at the foreshortening. This is all painted. Those aren't real columns, and those aren't real angels for that matter, or real people. This is a painted ceiling that is meant to give us the illusion of infinity. Think of the Library of Babel. Very similar kind of illusion, this architectural illusionism where we can paint, you know, a column that you can make it look like it's terribly high because you're doing things with the perspective. So this playing with perspective, this happens to be a very famous Baroque illusionist painter who happened also to be a Jesuit named Andrea Pozzo. But as I may start my text now, I will go to the detail here. You'll see the right-hand side. At the very, very center is Saint Ignatius rising to heaven. It's a celebration of the Jesuit order. But trompe l'oeil comes in all shapes and sizes. I'm switching now to a 19th century example, and it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek painting. It's called Venus Rising from the Sea, A Deception After the Bath. And what we're meant here is to see somehow the way that curtain hangs, and you'll see curtains are a big trompe l'oeil device. The way the curtain hangs and so forth, we're a deception after the bath. We'll keep going. Trompe l'oeil images share an effective intention of double wonderment. I've already said that. To make us wonder at what's real and then to marvel at the artist's ability to make us wonder in the first place. When Renaissance naturalism, which is what's being subverted here, strove to represent the real by offering viewers the proverbial transparent window through which to observe scenes and personages, illusionism of this sort subverts that realistic representation by calling attention to its own artifice. Here's another one of these Baroque ceilings, also in Rome. It's another Jesuit church. The Jesuits loved illusionism. Now let me see if I can make that pause just there. This is a vaulted ceiling, but it's not vaulted as high as this because the way that the arches around the periphery are painted, it's made to look like they're much higher than they are. But look at that central piece. That central piece is heaven. It's celestial glory. And what we see is people falling out of heaven around that. See those dark spots to the left on the top and on the bottom right of that oval? Those are people who have fallen out of heaven, who are going to hell. So or going to purgatory anyway. But again, and think of the Library of Babel one more time, this kind of Baroque illusionism plays with perspective in order to give us the sense that we are seeing the infinite. That the infinite is available to the believer in this church. This is a church, no, it's the San Ignacio, I don't have a slide of it, that also has a flat surface that's painted to look like a great dome. So the Baroque took pleasure in amplifying reality in this way, and so the churches are filled in Rome in particular, where the Baroque originates in about, well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, the beginning of the 17th century. There's a lot of this kind of illusionism meant to beguile the worshiper, impress, overawe the viewer. So an example of this, a few more visual examples, again in Rome and again in the Baroque period, this earlier than the Baroque really. This is a flat wall that's painted. I happen to have gone to this place. It's the Villa Farnesina in Rome. And there's a whole room that's painted as if it were a terrace and that you're looking out on the town. I had always wondered, seeing this picture, whether that bench and door on the right-hand side, on our right, was painted or real. I'm now going to report to you that it's real, that bench, but we can't tell. The door on the left is a painted door. Why is this interesting to us? We can say, well, it's interesting to us because Borges is doing some of the same kinds of things. Look at, let me see what I want to say to you about this. This is a Villa Farnesina. Architectural illusionism was also known in antiquity, and it was revived in the early 14th century. So it's not just a Baroque phenomenon, but it was in great vogue in the 15th and 16th century in Italy, and it continued in the 17th throughout Europe. The church domes we've seen are 17th century, high Baroque. This is a flat wall, and one more example of this kind of thing. This is in Florence. I'm not sure, I haven't seen this, whether one can't tell, whether it's a flat ceiling upon which this is painted or whether there's some rise, or indeed whether it's a wall. The idea is it's supposed to look like a great colonnaded thing. I think it's painted on a wall, now that I remember, with the sky at the top leading again to these vast vistas. We're going to look specifically at the Library of Babel for this kind of architectural illusionism. I'll just read a bit. This combination of hyperbolic space, we're back to hyperbole, even with Borges's little teeny stories. The combination of hyperbolic space and minute attention to pictorial detail again predicts the work of Jorge Luis Borges, for he too strives to create the illusion of infinite extension amidst richness of material detail in such stories as the Aleph, the Library of Babel, and Plon Ukbar Orbis Tertius. Those vistas and those teeny little details at once. His texts, like these painted surfaces, explore not so much what is real and what is not, but rather the multitude and often deceptive orders of the real. The aim of this kind of trompe l'oeil, whether textual or visual, is then not merely to undermine realistic representation, but also to amplify the viewer's or reader's experience of the real by pointing to realms that are impossible to represent realistically. How can you represent everything? What the Aleph contains. How can you represent infinity, that infinite library? You have to revert to small details. So here we have the little ornate things, even as the subject is magnificence and monumentality, there's also the miniature. Think of that section of Franz Roh where he talks about the monumental and the miniature. That's something that the magical realism involves. Okay, let's just look at another few pictures here. I'm going to go back to what I call perspective construction in the Library of Babel in a minute, but let's go ahead and look at the rest of our pictures. We've just looked at those Italian monumental ceilings and walls. Now, there's another strand in the 17th century, and that's the northern strand. Remember, by now, Holland is Protestant and not absolutely definitively so. Spain holds on to its northern possessions. That's why Belgium, the south, what was the south of all of Holland, stayed Catholic and remained under the Spanish Empire, oddly enough, under the Spanish crown until, I believe, the 18th and maybe even the 19th century. But Holland detaches itself. It's Protestant. Where do our Puritans set sail from to land on Plymouth Rock? From Holland, not from England. Remember, they've gone to Leiden, this hotbed of radical Protestantism. So there's a whole other feel about the work from Northern Europe, and especially the trompe l'oeil. It's domestic, it's small, it's about cupboards and cabinets, and I'm going to show you a few. I love these because Borges is such a paper world. You know, he's constantly citing this text or that text or the other text or looking at a metaphor. And so what is the challenge of the artist, the trompe l'oeil artist here? To make the canvas obviously seem 3D, but with paper. Let me say some things about this. Cupboards, cabinets, and niches were common in this perspectival illusionism, and they're filled with a welter of things, and they become the staples of trompe l'oeil painting, especially in the North, as I've said, because they too allow the artist to manipulate and disrupt the transparent window. What I also call, and what is called, Albertian Albertian perspective, let me say. Alberti was the one who codified in the Renaissance perspective, that you have to have a vanishing point, that you stand in front of the painting in a single spot and you look into this transparent window where you see a landscape or a scene. So this is, I'm saying, another way to disrupt that realistic perspective. Let me tell you what I wrote about it and see whether it makes sense to you. Here in a painting entitled Glass Cupboard Door by the Flemish painter Franciscus Gisprechts, the Albertian vanishing point is truncated by the flat surface of the cupboard door. There's no vanishing point, really. It's as if the vanishing point is the canvas itself. And so let's see, I'll start again. The Albertian vanishing point is truncated by the flat surface of the cupboard door and the back of the cupboard seen partially through the glass. A painted plane that appears to coincide with the surface of the canvas itself. I'm going to show you a detail of this. Oh. I'll show you a few more. Let's just see if that'll stay there for a minute. Unlike the architectural illusionism that we have just seen, which projects the illusion of infinite space behind the picture plane, remember those ceilings that go further than the picture plane by far into infinity, this kind of trompe l'oeil illusion consists of projecting in front of the picture plane. The challenge to the painter's skill at mimetic deception is to subvert the picture plane by making something as flat as paper appear to protrude into the viewer's space. So again, that disruption of the difference between the fictional space and my space, the viewer's space. We're going to see lots of examples of statues that want to jump out of their niches during this period, mixing up whether the statue is real or a representation. So look at a few more. What I've said here about the paper. Can you imagine painting this kind of thing? And here another. This becomes a kind of subgenre in the North. The paper rack, it's called, or the paper rack. It's like a bulletin board, a strip of velvet or leather behind which things are stuck. Now, you see what's going on with the manipulation of perspective here. There's no vanishing point. It's this flat back but it's not quite as if the things are flat, because see the knife in the upper middle, we get a shadow off of that. There's shadows cast by the pieces of paper, but this becomes like a virtuoso high degree of difficulty kind of painting. You have to be very good to give this illusion of things protruding into my space, protruding forward. As I say, it's the opposite of the illusion, the architectural illusionism, where it seems that everything's going away from me infinitely. Here, this stuff's coming into my world, into my space, my real live space, in ways that realism doesn't attempt or want to do. So, as I say, the folds and creases in the paper present ample opportunity for perspectival play. There are just a bunch of these. I think I have one more. Usually these will be painted for someone, and there'll be things that represent the person's life. They're kind of biographical. Look at the little pin cushion on the bottom left, and the scissors. We assume a seamstress, obviously a woman with things she must like to write. There's a quill pen up there on the upper right, and so forth. You see how these things, very domestic. This is a very interesting and odd one, as you see from the title, composition with liturgical vessels in a cabinet. Up above the glass there's a crucifix in the middle, and liturgical vessels, meaning things used in the Mass, and a rack with hanging objects. It's not something for everyone. It does seem odd to have this rack with gloves and pearls and so forth in front of a door that houses these liturgical vessels, but quite conceivable, I suppose. I've given you the date. As you see, it's middle of the 17th century. This is Baroque illusionism at its northern best. Then there's this kind of still life, which I'm interested in. This is one of the, I just don't quite have this mastered yet. There, maybe that'll stay for a minute. Sanchez Cotan is a great still life painter, Spanish. See how different it is, but it's still the domesticity of the larder, if you know that word, the kitchen cabinet. And see how, again, this is this kind of perspectival play that ruptures the picture plane, as I say. Look at that cucumber sticking out into my space, or that piece of melon. Why does he have those things hanging from a string, which you would never do in your cupboard? This is certainly not realistic. I think it's to emphasize the back wall, which truncates the picture space of this cabinet or this cupboard. Let me see what I have to say about it here. The picture plane is defined by the wall that frames the recessed larder, but a slice of melon and the end of a cucumber rupture the picture plane, appearing to protrude into the viewer's space. Again, the separation, and here's I've said it a whole lot of times now, we're going to see it with this bird in a minute. The separation between pictorial space and the viewer's space, the separation upon which Western realism depends, is undone. Sanchez-Cotan's vegetables and fruit are not painted images at all, but objects in the viewer's world. We're asked to say, wow, those are sticking out right here. Now, you can say, oh, if that hangs on a museum wall, and it certainly does, probably in the Prado in Madrid, you'll say, oh, that looks like a painting of vegetables and fruit to me. But you have to admit that there's something different going on than your usual still life, which will be a table with things on it. That he's playing with perspective and disrupting this distinction between the reader's world, or in this case the viewer's world, and the created world. So we've seen it when fiction lives in fiction and all of that. We've seen it last week in some detail, and here again in painting. I want to pursue a set of trompe-l'oeil devices that rupture the picture plane of realistic representation in similar ways. If Sanchez-Cotan's painted objects protrude into the viewer's world in order to disclaim their status as painted objects, the devices I want to show you now do something like the opposite. This is Jacob Biltius, as you see, a Dutchman again, and he calls this a trompe-l'oeil. That's the name of the painting. These objects also pretend to occupy the viewer's space, but they do so by calling attention to the painting, as a two-dimensional artifact, as unreal. Remember, I just said the opposite about those melons and quinces. This now he's fiddling with another idea. This is calling attention to itself as a painting, I'm going to argue. There are pictorial details, and here it's the nail and the insects that are supposedly on the surface of the painting, and thus outside the represented scene and in the real space of the viewer. That nail sticks out into my space. And those insects, well, they're just crawling on. Now you can say, well, they're crawling on the wall where the chicken hangs and the other bird, perhaps. But let me show you another example of this kind of thing, where something is put on the surface of the painting. There are two I'm going to show you that are backs of paintings. Now, have you ever seen a painted back of a painting before? What's the point? First of well, I'll tell you. I think I know. It's playing again with the notion of realism. Is this a real back of a real painting, we're supposed to ask? What are those pieces of paper that are tacked on to the surface of the back of the painting? I'm going to show you another one by the same painter. These became quite popular at this time, and I argue that it's to again disrupt our notion of realistic representation. It's to remind us that paintings are objects in the world, that they have backs as well as fronts, instead of to give us the illusion that painting is a transparent window on the world. So it's calling attention to painting as painting, just as the fly does, and I'm going to show you, or the fly or the nail, and I'm going to show you another great example of this. There's lots of this kind of painting. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria. We know all about her. She was tortured and killed, a Christian martyr, and we know that because she's holding a palm frond in her hand. Martyred saints often hold palm fronds. It's the great age of martyrdom. What was going on in the 17th century? The Catholic world was expanding into unknown territories, including all of Latin America, and they needed people who were willing to risk their lives, especially clerics who were willing to go and Christianize great populations. And so martyrdom became a great subject and a great desideratum, that is, a great thing to look for. So the martyrs, the Christian martyrs, including St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was broken on what is called a Catherine wheel, an instrument of torture. You see it in front of you. You can always tell St. Catherine because there will often be a broken piece of the wheel beside her, because every martyr, despite the fact they die, of course, they transcend the death of their enemies. St. Lucy, remember, has her eyes plucked out, and she's often represented with her eyes on a platter, and her eyes are still in her head, because of course God is going to take care of that. But all of that's beside the point. What's to the point is that fly right by the palm frond to our left. What's that doing there? It's showing us that this is a painting. It's calling attention to the fact that this isn't real. Of course, it's an odd painting. It's supposed to be a statue in a niche in any case. But flies are wonderful. And I'm going to argue that the footnotes in Borges' stories are like flies. They disrupt our sense of the realism of the thing. Another example of the fly, which see if you can find it. Tweensy beansy on the left knee of our seated cleric, our seated cardinal. And we could say, well, that's just a fly that sat there. But knowing the conventions of Trompe lOeil, the artist wants to remind us that this is a representation, that fly is, in my world, sitting on the surface of the canvas, which represents these four fellows. The fly pretends to occupy the space of the viewer rather than the space of the painting. Curtains are used to similar effect, to suggest that the painted scene is fictional, but that the curtain, which may be drawn across the painting to protect it from overexposure, is real because it exists in the space of the viewer. These intrusions, or alternative layers of represented reality, fly, nail, curtain. I'll show you another example. Look at the curtain. This is a curtain in front of a painting of a church. The curtain pretends to be unpainted. It pretends to be real. It pretends to protect the painting of the church because people had curtains in front of paintings. So there's a way in which here we're getting, again, these layers of reality. So these intrusions usurp the mimetic or realistic claim of the painting by themselves claiming to be real. Now, I want to show you the saints' lives do a little bit the same thing. This is now to take this point perhaps further than I need to in this class. But it's very common in New World Baroque painting to have a picture of a saint, in this case two saints, those little boys there who were martyred and for Christianity. And I show you these, there are any number of examples where, and I'll show you a couple more, in fact, one more, where in scenes behind the figures, in the foreground, we have scenes from the life of the saints. You can see on the right-hand side that these little fellows have been decapitated because their heads are there and their bodiless heads, you may not be able to see it, but they were martyred. You see they have their palm fronds. We know, of course, that they were martyred for that reason, and all those flowers down below. And on the other side, the left-hand side, someone is being flagellated. I take it the little boys, you see someone with a whip. I wanted just to show you that this is, see the angel up above? They have a beautiful detail in the book that I took these paintings from. So this, you could say all Baroque religious art is illusionistic in a way, because here's an angel floating on a cloud. It looks a little like a boulder, but it's a cloud. I mean, obviously that's magical real in some sense, as we've talked about the saints and martyrs and exaggeration of emotionality of Baroque painting with respect to Garcia Marquez. Now it's funny that I come back to that with Borges, and I probably shouldn't. We should probably stay with the fine-tuned illusionism, but nonetheless, I wanted to show you the ways in which these kinds of saints' lives are also, in a sense, trompe l'oeil. Let me just say a couple more words about saints' lives, and particularly the martyred saints' lives are often depicted as realistic narratives interrupted by miraculous glimpses of infinity. That's what that, you see the lamb there in the middle, that's the, heaven, that's the very middle center, upper center, is all of heaven. represented, of course, by that distancing perspective, again, at the same time that we see these scenes of torture and martyrdom below. I'm going to relate that to the secret miracle, which we've talked about. Isn't that a kind of saint's life trompe l'oeil, where we get that interruption in the bullet as it speeds for 1 year? We talked about it last time. Isn't that a kind of saint's life that gets interrupted by a divine intervention, let's say? So I want to show you one more of these. This is one of my favorite New World Baroque paintings. It's the Czech saint. Is anyone Czech here? Saint John Nepomuc, San Juan Nepomuceno. He's very important in the New World for reasons I'm not altogether clear on, but we get scenes from his life. Unfortunately, my slide cuts off the one behind the saint's head. You see half of a confessional. He was the confessor to the Queen. This is in the 17th century, fairly recent saint, a Baroque saint. And when the king wanted to know what the Queen had said, he refused to tell. And he was therefore chucked off a bridge. You see that on the right-hand middle distance here, on the right-hand side. He was thrown into the river. And to this day in Prague, there's a bridge that is devoted to his martyrdom from that bridge. So, but what do we see? So we get the two realistic planes, if you want, his being the confessor to the Queen and his being martyred for that reason. But what is he doing here? He's envisioning all of heaven and earth. Well, in particular, Christ's suffering on the cross. This is the kind of painting that you'd say, oh, that goes much more with Garcia Marquez than it does with Borges. And I think that's true, except for the perspectival play that I'm indicating. And then one final one, our wonderful Bernini. We've seen his, of course, Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. With respect to Garcia Marquez. This is just one of so many examples of his work where figures are jumping into the real space of the viewer. Niches are everywhere, and saints occupy niches everywhere in Baroque construction. But what hadn't happened until Bernini really is having, the hand of the angel and the hand of Habakkuk and the foot, the legs sticking out into our space. It's in a small chapel where there's another niche across the way where you have another figure doing almost the same thing. Just, you see the dynamism and the spatial confusion, if you want, of what used to be in classicism a nice, neat, enclosed space. So again, that rupturing of the picture plane in ways that manipulate our sense of what's real. Obviously, we aren't going to stand in front of this niche and say, I think that's really Habakkuk and really an angel. We're going to say that's a fabulous statue by Bernini is probably what we're going to say. But actually, I was on the trail of Bernini this summer in Rome, and I want to tell you that what I said when I got to this church was, oh, poo, because this chapel was being restored and we couldn't get in. I sort of looked over a curtain, but I didn't dare go under the curtain to see it close up. But anyway, we don't really think this is going to be real, and yet the trompe l'oeil devices are wishing us to wonder first what is real, and second to wonder at the artist's ability to make us wonder. That double level of wonder, because it takes such technique, it takes such precision, and I think that's where this is useful for beginning our discussion of Borges. So I will turn off my slideshow. And we'll open our books. Questions or comments? Anybody want to go back to any of these? Yeah, Kathy?
I just really get this presentation was comparable to John Donne. Is it Donne?
Theme.
John
Yeah.
Theme's,
Textualization, yeah.
Of the textualization fable, both in the writer and the spectator of art, paintings.
Yes.
One how, and these pictures really show like the portrait of the infinite.
Yeah.
We see that when we're absorbed into the book.
Yeah,
When we're
yeah.
absorbed into a painting. And then the opposite is when he's talking about the writing or the painting intruding on our world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the textualization fable that he talks about is a more specific, or it's one of the specific versions of this larger trompe l'oeil effect that we're asked to wonder, in that case, because a work is embedded in another. Now here with the fly on the surface, let's say, it's a little different. There's not one work embedded in another like Hamlet, watching Hamlet, or the biscuit tin. But what it is, it's the same effect because we're asked to wonder what's real. So I appreciate your drawing that over to John Thiem, because all of these techniques are ones that Borges engages. And part of why some people, in fact, don't like his work, because he won't allow you to enjoy the setting or what he wants you to do is enjoy the puzzle, to enjoy the abstract ideas that he inserts into the work by doing these funny kinds of counter-realistic things. So let's I guess go to wherever we want to go, but why not the Library of Babel, just since I showed you all of that architectural illusionism, and we'll proceed from there. Can anybody help us out with this story, just so the sound of my own voice isn't so tedious? Who's read it and can comment on it for us? Just give us some quick ideas. Let's see, the page is what? I'm not even there myself. 51, thank you. Okay, help us out. I'll call on you. Oh, Kim, you're looking like you're willing over there. Would you mind? What's going on? Just a little plot summary.
There's this library in the galleries that it's supposed to be and I guess it's a metaphor for the universe.
Uh-huh.
So there's all these books, they're all different books. It's basically all the books that have been written and that could be written.
Yeah.
The alphabet given. So basically.
Yeah, but there is this little Borgesian shrug, as I call it, at the end. What do we learn at the end? What is worth? I mean, a great library, infinite numbers of books, but what are they about? Does anybody know? Can they be read?
Well, most of them are just nonsensical because of they all change with all the possible variations in the orders of letters and commas and periods.
Yeah.
So you can't ever find a book that is actually makes sense. It's just
Yeah.
It's like one.
So if we say it's a metaphor for the universe and the librarian is a metaphor for God, as he proposes, this is a rather grim view, isn't it? That this is a world that cannot be made sense of. Look at the very end. And then we'll look at that funny little footnote, which is the fly on the surface of the printed text, according to me. Let's read the last paragraph together. We get this elaborate discussion of this, what I call perspectival construction. We're here all about tiny measurements. We know exactly how many, through the infinite. It's a bit like the 4 years, 11 months, and 2 days that it rains. We get specificity, which is supposed to mean infinity, or for a very long time, in this case a very big space. But look at the end and wonder what we do with this. I've just written the word infinite. I have not interpolated this adjective out of rhetorical habit. I say that it is not illogical to think that the world is infinite. Those who judge it to be limited postulate that in remote places the corridors and stairways and hexagons can conceivably come to an end, which is absurd. Those who imagine it to be without limit forget that the possible number of books does have such a limit. I venture to suggest this solution to the ancient problem. The library is unlimited and cyclical. If an eternal traveler, this is this beautiful shrug, what are we going to do about this? If an eternal traveler were to come across it in any direction, after centuries he would see the same volumes. He would see that the same volumes were repeated in the same disorder, which thus repeated would be an order, the order. My solitude is gladdened by this elegant hope. So a kind of, well, maybe someday someone will note that there's a pattern, at which point, even though it's disorderly, it's a kind of order. So it's a kind of, if we find Borges amusing, as I in fact do, it's a kind of parody on our human desires to systematize, to organize, to explain. He says the world is limitless. How maybe someday we'll understand it. In the meantime, what we have is a lot of organization. However you talk about this story, it's very hard not to read it as an allegory, as an extended metaphor for our understanding of the world. I think in part it's intended, just as I think the Aleph is intended to be a metaphor for the universe, and I think we should go there next. But I guess what I like in my own sense of this story, and I want to talk about some trompe-l'oeil devices, but if it's an allegory, I think it's not an allegory for the universe, though it says in particular places the library is the universe. But I think it's not a metaphor for the universe so much as for our perception of the universe, for our limitless representations or fictions or religions or novels that attempt to include and embrace the universe. So that human desire to understand and to know, even as we see the impossibility of doing so. So, I mean, I guess Borges' suspicion of systematizing is something that we're going to see again and again. His suspicion of systems that are true, are the one true way to do. So what he does is exactly what the trompe-l'oeil paintings do. He said, don't be so sure of what you're seeing. Don't be so sure of what you're reading. Don't be so sure of what you know. Ask what you know. Ask what's real. And he writes stories that make you do so. We hope. I hope. I hope that's what they make you do instead of throw your book across the room. Look at that funny, I mean, I don't know if you paid attention to the footnotes. It's rare that you get footnotes in fiction. Why? Because that breaks the transparent window. A footnote is the author telling the reader something. That's an acknowledgement that there's a reader-writer relationship that isn't realistic. That is, that realism presents the fictional world as true, as existing. Counter-realism, Borgesian magical realism, puts footnotes because it wants to remind you it's not true. He wants to remind you that this is a text. It's hardly even worth reading the footnote. It recurs, as you see, to the 17th century, the Baroque period, and he gives more examples. If you don't like this example of infinity, then try a few others, right? That's basically the way he lists 3 other ideas about an infinite world and the ways that they might be more persuasive than this one. Let me read to you what I've said about the perspectival construction when I tried to connect my paintings to Borges' work. I'll just read this little passage if you don't mind. Consider, for example, the Baroque perspective construction in Borges' story, The Library of Babel. With its minute description of the vast geometry of the library, think of those ceilings, its mathematically measured distances and identical corridors, staircases and towers, each with its exactly numbered shelves, books, pages, lines, and letters. Even as we're also told that the library is infinite, immeasurable, and unknowable. Doesn't that remind you of those ceilings, the tiny little details of the angels' wings and the columns, and at the same time that it's saying, but who can know the glory of God? So I'm not saying that this is a religious story, but I'm saying it's the same impulse to try to say it all, and how can you say it all? You can only fiddle with realism. Here in this story, Borges dispenses with the Albertian frame, that is the realistic transparent window that fixes the distance between viewer and represented space. And instead he projects the illusion of infinite space behind the picture plane of his realistic description. Those towers and hexagonal things go on and on and on. It's like architectural illusionism, the architectural illusionism we've seen. So he projects the illusion of infinite space behind the picture plane of his realistic description. His narrator describes infinite spatial extension at the same time that he also pays assiduous attention to material detail, not failing twice to notice 2 very small closets. Did you notice this? It's hysterically funny. Quote, in the first, one may sleep standing up, in the other, satisfy one's fecal necessities. It's a little toilet in the midst of all of this, right? So you get the vast perspective and the little closet. It's the first paragraph, page 51. Later, he again juxtaposes, quote, the inexhaustible stairways for the traveler and latrines for the seated librarian, unquote, page 52. What I say is that this is a hilarious negotiation between infinite space and the functional constraints of real human bodies. And it allows Borges to parody both the mimetic or realistic assiduousness and the metaphysical aspirations that underpin the kind of architectural illusionism that we've seen. So there's a disjunction then, to make a long story short, between this vision of infinite space and the small nature, the small length of Borges's stories. Just as there's always, when you get the kind of infinity structures. Remember on those last saints' lives where we get infinity up there, the shining lamb above the two little justo y pastor, the two little Roman martyrs, and the job of the artist is to make us think it's big when it's in fact a canvas. It might even be a fairly big canvas, but it's not as big as infinity. And same with Borges. There's always an irony of disproportion between his cosmic vision and his incredibly condensed stories. With Garcia Marquez, we don't feel it because, all of that Baroque profusion of description and all of those magical moments of blood and rising to heaven and so forth is in a fairly big novel. So that irony isn't the same as in Borges, where he wants to give us the picture of the universe in 5 pages, and does. So these perspectival manipulations I want you to pay attention to in this story. When you read it again, if you read it for the first time, if you haven't, pay attention to all of the minute description of infinite space. We should laugh. How can you do that? It is almost like an ecstatic vision, a saint's vision when heaven and earth opens up and everything is available. I didn't bring my copy of the Aleph because it's posted on the web, and maybe, does anybody have a copy of it with you that you printed out? Oh, good. Richard's going to help us. I remember you'd read what was on the web, Richard, that first day, so this is perfect. Does any of what we're saying, Richard, here about the Library of Babel and about these trompe-l'oeil perspectival manipulations ring a bell when you think of the Aleph? Can you apply any of these? Or better yet, if you don't want to do that, just tell us what the story is about.
The Aleph is all about infinite space in a
area.
minute area.
Yeah,
So
in a basement even. Yeah. And
as far as perspective goes, the guy laying on his back.
Yes, there is that funny moment. Would you read that to us? There's that funny moment where he's cramped into this little space and he lies on his back and he's trying to see everything at once, and he does. He does. But how is Borges or how is any author or any painter going to show us infinite space? By showing us some of its parts, and those parts are going to signify the whole. Tell us, Richard. Well, where he goes down to the downstairs, there's all this funny, sort of twitty, Borgesian characters are often very fastidious and a little snooty, and we got this odd little dispute between Carlos Daneri, I believe his name is, Argentino Daneri, with the narrator. But Daneri has told him, there's something in my basement you have to see, correct? Remember how it goes? Richard, you do it.
So he goes over there apparently he was in love with this woman, she died, and then he starts a relationship with her father, and he goes over there to see this Aleph, you said Aleph.
In Spanish we say Aleph, but it's the first letter of the Jewish alphabet, and it's pronounced, I am told, Aleph, so we'll say Aleph.
So he goes to see this Aleph, and he goes downstairs into the basement where it is. And the father says to him, as a pillow, this is quite threadbare, but if it's padded even half an inch higher, you won't see a thing, and there you'll lie, feeling ashamed and ridiculous. All right, now, scroll down.
Now, does everybody know where Richard is? Do you have it on, Richard, what page? Okay, everybody there, good. Thank you. Keep going.
Feeling ashamed and ridiculous. All right now, spoil that Hulk of yours there on the floor and count off 19 steps. And then, do you want me to read this next paragraph? Because
We'll read a little bit of it. It might be kind of fun to get a sense of the profusion, because even in this teeny little story, we have a sense of the magnificence of infinity, right? Tell.
I went through with his absurd requirements, and at last he went away. The trapdoor was carefully shut. The blackness, in spite of a chink that I later made out, seemed to me absolute. For the first time, I realized the danger I was in. I'd let myself be locked in the cellar by a lunatic after gulping down a glass full of poison. I knew that back of Carlos's transparent boasting lay a deep fear that I might not see the promised wonder. To keep his madness undetected, to keep me from admitting that he was mad, Carlos had to kill me. I felt a shock of panic when I tried to pin to my uncomfortable position and not to the effect of a drug. I shut my eyes, I opened them, then I saw the olive.
And then keep going, just a little bit more.
I arrive now at the ineffable core of my story.
Ineffable. What does that mean?
Unspeakable.
Unsayable, unspeakable, unexpressible. The ineffable core. This narrator is going to have to say something that can't be said. He's going to have to describe infinity when it can't possibly be described. Continue, Richard. I'm just glossing your reading here. Don't mind me.
No worries.
The ineffable core of my story.
And here begins my despair as a writer. All language is a set of symbols whose use among its speakers assumes a shared past. How then can I translate into words the limitless olive, which my floundering mind can scarcely encompass? Mystics, faced with the same problem, fall back on symbols. To signify the Godhead, one Persian speaks of a bird that somehow is all birds, allinus de insulis, of a sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere.
That's going to resonate, that line, with the fearful sphere of Pascal. Okay, just keep that in mind, because we're going to have a whole story where he examines metaphors of everythingness. Yeah.
Ezekiel, of a four-faced angel who at one and the same time moves east and west, north and south. Not in vain do I recall those inconceivable analogies, because they bear some relation to the olive. Perhaps the gods might grant me a similar metaphor, but then this account would become contaminated by literature, by fiction. Really, what I want to do is impossible, for any listing of an endless series is doomed to be infinitesimal. In that single gigantic instant, I saw millions of acts, both delightful and awful. Not one of them amazed me more than the fact that all of them occupied the same point in space without overlapping or transparency. What my eyes beheld was simultaneous, but what I shall now write down will be successive, because language is successive. Nonetheless, I'll try to recollect what I can.
And then comes this fabulously beautiful list. Right, and thank you, Richard. I'll count on you all to pay attention to the list. You know, Borges he seems clipped and he seems Hemingway-esque. He seems flat, in a sense, after reading Garcia Marquez. But then you read a list like this and you say, Garcia Marquez has nothing on him. But again, this idea, like the Library of Babel, that there's so much that can't possibly be expressed, but how do you do it? Well, you describe it, in this case, in a list. And the list is a synecdoche. There's a rhetorical device called synecdoche. You don't need to know it, but it's SYNECDOCHE. It's a kind of metaphor where the part stands for the whole. The example that's always given is all hands on deck, meaning sailors, but you use the hand to stand for the sailor, right? All hands on deck. Very banal little example, but that's the way what's going on here. We have a list. It's a beautiful and a long list, rather lyrical for Borges, really, and it's meant to stand for everything. Remember the list that we looked at in the Circular Ruins when the magician prays to the god, and he says, he was neither. He looked like a horse or a tiger, but he was also rose, tempest, bull. Remember that? And those 5 things are like this. God, he was all of these things, but you can't say everything. And so Borges is such a fascinating writer because there's this huge let's say, imperialistic urge, it's imperialistic in a non-political sense, he has a huge urge to encompass everything. So he writes teeny little stories, and he gives us 5 attributes of the God in this story of the circular ruins, and we're meant to see the universe whole. It's again a trompe l'oeil. I mean, every one of his stories, or not every one, but a lot of them are trompe l'oeils. We're going to talk next time about the others, but the Garden of Forking Paths, isn't that another? The Labyrinth, isn't that another? The Dream. All of these images that recur and recur are about multiplicity that can't be spoken, that's ineffable. So the Garden of Forking Paths is that every event in this story would take every possible turn until you had a labyrinthine story. It can only be conceived of. It can't be done on the page. So I'm going to let you go. I hope that some of this is suggestive, and I do very much ask you to finish reading the stories for Borges' stories for next time, so we can range across the entire selection. See you Thursday.